Thank you very much, Pete. I really appreciate that. When Pete asked me to come down here, he didn't say this was the hardest panel with the most difficult question. He said, do you want to come to Pepperdine and spend the day by the beach? But we appreciate the opportunity, and we have, through the Economic Summit, been very involved in convening stakeholders, working with a variety of our regional partners. We've developed an all-of-the-above framework that evolved into Governor Brown's housing principles that were in his 2017 governor's budget and helped to frame the legislative discussion and debate. We were very involved in creating the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District and are involved in implementation of that in a variety of places throughout the state of California. And we've been doing a lot of work with the people whose idea was the Opportunity Zone, including Joe Sandberg, who's another member of our board who created Cali ITC, and me. So it's an idea that came largely from California, largely from people that have made wealth here, and largely are trying to figure out how to address poverty in California by investing in distressed communities. As we began the day here, our leadoff speaker, Charles Marone, said California was incoherent. And my first reaction was, yes, but it's our incoherence. And my second one was, he doesn't know the half of it. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the other half of that in our last hour here today. California Forward at its roots is this governance reform organization which recognizes that California is an incredibly complicated place. With 58 counties, one so big it could be a nation, one so small it doesn't have a county jail, 488 cities, 1,000 school districts, 73 community college districts, so many special enterprise districts that the Special Districts Association makes an estimate of how many there are. And so we're going to begin this conversation with this central question about how people at different levels of government think about the role of that government in solving it and meeting this public priority, and making sure we have adequate, safe housing in healthy and sustainable communities. And we've got a terrific panel here today, and I'm just going to run down the names, and then they will take it from there with some opening comments. And all the way to my left is Lydia Romero. Lydia is the city manager of Lemon Grove. She's also the city manager in residence here at the Davenport Institute. She's worked in the city of San Marcos and the city of San Rafael, and so she's got lots of saints and angels on her side, and we look forward to her thoughts. Richard Bruckner is the former director of the Department of Regional Planning in LA, and that appears to me that the most beneficial part of that is to say former, right? That you were there, that you contributed, you survived, and now you can share your wisdom. But he's also grounded in the 10 years he spent as the Director of Planning and Development for Pasadena, a city with a long history of groundbreaking city planning, development, preservation of quality neighborhoods, and perhaps a really good case study of what's possible at the local level. Rick Bishop is a longtime colleague and friend. He's the Executive Director of the Western Riverside Council of Government, and he represents what he thinks that middle ground where local governments come together and try to think and act on behalf of the region, and are in many ways that intermediary between what the state says, what the intonation, what the mandate, what the encouragement is from all of the folks up in Sacramento where I live and work, down to all of these various communities. And finally, to my immediate left is Greg Greenway, whose title today is as a member of the Redwood City San Mateo Chamber of Commerce. So there's some endearing aspect of that. But most importantly, he's been a housing advocate in the Bay Area for 20 years. He was the founding member of the Housing Leadership Council for San Mateo County during the original .com boom, and most recently has consulted with the County of San Mateo in their Home for All initiative, which has really been a creative and thoughtful effort at building consensus and agreement around how we're going to provide for adequate housing for our neighbors. So we're really grateful for this panel. We're going to start with some opening comments, but because we're the last session here, we really want to make sure we dedicate time to your questions. So feel free to turn to those postcards quickly, write down the questions that you've been dying to ask. This is the group you've been dying to ask them of, and we'll try to incorporate as many of those before we head to the beach and for adult beverage. So with that, Lydia.
I'm ready to go. Good afternoon, everyone. So let me just introduce my community to you. So I'm the city manager. I'm responsible for the implementation of the city's council's policies, and I think most of you heard one of our biggest issues is land use issue. Lemon Grove is a city in East San Diego County. So we're an edge city out of the city of San Diego. We are 3.8 square miles. Our population is 26,000. We are the most diverse city in San Diego County. In fact, we are a majority minority city. Our median income is $42,000, whereas the San Diego County standard is $62,000. So you know where we are in the workforce housing area. When the city incorporated in 1978, they incorporated for land use issues. They were a built-out city in 1978, and they had uses on top of uses, and the county wasn't responding to the residents at that time. So they decided, it took them 3 tries, but they decided to incorporate as a city, and this is where we stand today. We're lucky in Lemon Grove that we're one of the 13 cities in the state of California that has met all of their housing goals for this last housing session. We've met our affordable, very low, moderate, and market rate housing. And in fact, we've produced over 41% beyond our housing goals. How did we do that? I think it's a combination of good in-reach with our residents and community engagement, and showing them the benefits of housing for all economic levels. Additionally, they actually used, which is an old tool that we had, which we don't have, is redevelopment. Redevelopment was key to that particular city's success in the last 10 years. Redevelopment no longer exists. Redevelopment helped build the infrastructure that supported the new housing development. And that was the trade-off that the residents that live there at the current time wanted to see with the housing issues. So as you can hear from my perspective, I'm a proponent that land use planning and governance really needs to stay at the local level. That is the closest level, and that is the level in which we get everybody's voice, opposed to a one-size-fits-all. Because my issues in Lemon Grove are different than the issues in San Mateo or Napa or Chico. And all of our issues are very different. So that's where we need to engage the residents on this one-size-fits-all. As I've mentioned, we have overproduced our housing that we need for this housing element cycle. However, I still have 2 projects entitled. They have been titled for the last 4 years for housing, and the market rate developer is shopping it around for the highest price. Now that's what a lot of my colleagues in cities deal with, is we have folks that come in and entitle a project, go through the process, but they don't build. I don't know if that was said during the conference, but cities don't build housing. Private developers build housing. And how can we incentivize the private developers to look besides the market aspects to build some of the housing? We don't control it, yet we have all of the penalties. Most recently, Governor Newsom is talking about taking away our transportation dollars, hard-fought transportation dollars, if cities don't produce housing. I don't really like that step because it's really not the city's fault. I think the most useful aspect is perhaps bring something back that looks a little bit like redevelopment, so it gives residents the ability to build some of the infrastructure that is needed as a trade-off. I think in the introduction, it mentioned that I work for the city of San Marcos. City of San Marcos, when I got there, was the fastest growing community in San Diego County. They were building housing stock upon housing stock, and the last piece is being built, a 450 housing unit right near Cal State San Marcos. The reason that was successful and the reason we didn't get pushback from the community is 1, redevelopment dollars, but 2, we required development to pay their way. So they helped fund increased streets. They helped fund an intra-city shuttle for transportation. They helped fund building of new parks for which the resident had an obligation. That's how that community was able to grow when I got there, from 52,000 to now they're cresting at about 90,000 with all the new additional housing stock on there. So the bill list in which you've seen is what we perceive on the local level as really a threat to local control. And it goes back to that one-size-fits-all. My community would not be able to market or absorb the high-density transit housing that is talked in SB 50, Wiener's current bill. There is no way my community would be able to adjust from that. So I think we need to come up with some sort of compromise to take a look at that. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Lydia. Richard?
Well, I guess the first rule is never follow a city manager. It was a great overview of where we are, and congratulations to you to meeting your RENA goals. I think you're one of probably half a dozen cities that have done that. I want to build on that, and I reminded of a lesson that the mayor of Pasadena, in my very first discussion with him, said there are two things we do in the city of Pasadena that are important. We pass a budget and we control our land uses. So that is an affirmation of what the city manager just said. And as we look at the long list of bills and what the state is trying to do and how to solve this, my view is everyone should keep in their lane and do what they do best. And local governments, most of them do their land use planning very well because they engage their neighborhoods, they have conversations with their neighborhoods, they strike a compromise with the neighborhoods. There are a lot of things they can do better in that, and you heard earlier a comment about the city of LA aligning its long-term plans, which are an outgrowth of the conversation with the neighbors, with the actual zoning, so it gets built as the conversation concluded. But the other part of this is what the state does well and what the state doesn't do well. One of the things the state has done poorly over the last few years is implementation of the California Environmental Quality Act, both through their guidelines and through the courts. And if we're going to work our way out of this housing jam, we really need to look at what are some of the impediments, and CEQA clearly is an impediment. People have been calling out Jennifer Hernandez all day, and I will do the same. Because she has put together a paper, or over the years has put together a paper, and I was pleased to see it was recently refreshed, that actually goes into the statistics of where CEQA has been abused in lawsuits and how the anti-growth folks have used CEQA. It's amazing the number of lawsuits and the focus on infill development, on infrastructure that would support infill development versus greenfield development. CEQA has been completely abused in the inner city and in the places that we all know should get development. And we can talk about a lot of reasons why that has happened, but clearly there needs to be some resolution to how we deal with CEQA, particularly in infill sites and infrastructure. And with that,
Great. Thank you, Richard. Rick?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. You know, a lot of people ask, what is WRCOG and where is Western Riverside County? And I'm always sort of struck by the question because the answer is in the name, which is Western Riverside County. But just to give you some context, our cities include at the far west Corona, which we're a big fan of global warming because we know in the near future we can change the name to Corona Del Mar. And then all the way down south to Wine Country and Temecula, and then east to Banning, basically out towards Palm Springs. It is still the fastest growing area in California. Western Riverside County as a whole is adding 50,000 people a year and is projected to do so through the year 2040. And just to give you some context, that's the equivalent of adding a city the size of Lake Elsinore. Has anybody been out to see the poppies? Lake Elsinore every year. Or a city of Glendora, or Cerritos, or Rosemead, or Diamond Bar, or Petaluma. That's significant growth there. And one thing I was struck with Lydia's comment, entitlements aren't the problem in Western Riverside County. My staff tells me that there are over 200,000 homes that are entitled at this moment in Western Riverside County, and yet even with the rebound in the economy over the course of the last 6 or 7 years, we're building about 5,000 homes a year in Western Riverside County. So it's going to take 40 years just to exhaust the number of homes that are entitled right now. That's certainly not the problem. What I think the problem is, or what are contributors to the problem, is that we are seeing household income in our subregion actually decreasing. The household income in Western Riverside County has actually gone down from about $63,000 in 2012 to $62,000 now. It doesn't sound like a lot, but we've also seen an uptick in the price of housing, even in a region that is largely seen as being affordable. And so what that is really doing, the combination of those two things, is that it's making it more difficult to afford a home in an area that is largely viewed as being affordable. And that creates a drive till you qualify kind of standard, which is what leads to suburban sprawl at a major level. And so that's what we're seeing in Western Riverside County. Also wanted to tack on to something that Lydia said, and that is this notion about one size fits all. I certainly don't love. We'll probably talk more about the 180 or so bills that are out there right now, and that in itself, probably merits some comment that probably wouldn't be real positive. But when you think about this one-size-fits-all planning, what is good for Northern California isn't always good for Southern California. Strangely, Western Riverside County is classified as being urban in the same context as LA. And so we see housing requirements and legislation and standards such as the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities grants, being allocated. Well, areas in Western Riverside County don't nearly have the levels of density or the transit and able to qualify for those funds. And so you have these well-intended, pieces of legislation that are trying to build housing around high-quality transit areas, and we call it transit-oriented development. But in Western Riverside County, we don't have much transit to orient around. So what does that leave us with in terms of being able to compete to build housing, much less affordable housing, and much less to focus on housing that is transit friendly? So I think those are some of the issues that at least create a little bit of context for us. I'm also very interested in talking. Hopefully, we'll have the chance to talk more about the fact that just building housing by itself isn't a solution. I mean, housing is part of an overall quality of life agenda. And if you look to inland California, to build 200,000 homes, well, what's it matter if you don't have adequate employment opportunities out there for those people? If all they're doing is getting in their car and driving, continuing to drive 2.5 hours to LA to their job, I don't know if you've really created much of a great situation other than you provided housing for people to get to at 9 o'clock at night, and then they wake up at 4 in the morning. I was struck by a comment that a resident made years and years and years ago before he even took this job. It was a show, I think it was called like 2020 or something like that. I don't know if it was Ted Koppel who was the host, but they actually had this special, this is 25 years ago, on these increasing commutes from cities like Moreno Valley into LA. And they talked to this one gentleman, and he said, oh, well, yeah, the commute's horrible, but I've got the system beat. I get up at 2 in the morning, and I drive my car to LA, and there's no traffic, and then I park in the underground garage, and then I sleep in the car until 7:45. I've got the system beat. And I go, I don't think you've got the system beat. I don't think you've got the system beat. So, part of the solution, I think, to this housing crisis isn't just housing. It has to do with being able to provide jobs near the existing housing stock to create a quality of life component. And then one other thing I wanted to mention, and this is particularly troublesome in our area, not only is median income declining in Western Riverside County, but there was just recently a study completed by the University of Redlands at the impacts of automation, and the study concluded that that inland Southern California is among the most vulnerable areas to the impacts of automation. And so you're looking at an economy that, yes, it's having a lot of job growth, but these are jobs that are very susceptible to automation, which further exacerbates this issue of, are there going to be people that have the kinds of jobs that can afford homes? So you can't just build homes, you have to have people that can afford them. So we're doomed.
Yeah. We're going to solve that, though, before 5 o'clock. So thank you, Rick. Greg?
Thanks. So at the risk of appearing that I belonged on a previous panel, I'm going to come at this question of the appropriate balance of state, regional, and local authority by talking about what we might consider a fourth level, or at least a parallel conversation, which is the role of the public. And I promise that I will get to the subject of this panel, but I want to start with an assertion that might seem like a diversion, or at least a digression. And that assertion is that if cities carefully design community engagement processes, it can significantly increase public support for housing solutions. Community engagement means lots of things to different people. Probably to a lot of folks in this room, it's a hackneyed term. So let me say what I mean by that. What are the essential characteristics of what I mean? And this is based on my experience with advocacy and what I found to be effective. The first characteristic is that it occurs apart from the formal, legally required public process before decisions are made. The second characteristic is that it is essentially a formula of information plus deliberation plus inclusion. Information, meaning providing community members with fact-based, fully vetted, balanced information. Deliberation, meaning you give them a chance to talk with one another and consider their options in circumstances that allow them to have the time and the information they need to make different kinds of choices. My preferred form of that is facilitated small and large group dialogue. And inclusion, this is a critical piece, is that those folks who are involved in that kind of deliberation, in this kind of process I'm talking about, are not the kinds of people who typically would show up to any kind of government meeting. It's having vastly different kinds of people, if it's dialogue-based, with vastly different life experiences, sitting around the table and talking to one another. And in this kind of a process, the role of government is primarily to listen. The third characteristic is that engagement, this kind of a process that I'm talking about, needs to be sustained over time. And I would refer to Rick Cole's mentioning the general plan process they went through in Azusa, whereby you phase the conversations with your community over time, starting with something like, what are the values that characterize this community? Moving to the question of how do these housing issues or problems impact our community specifically? Moving then to a conversation about what are the kinds of solutions in general that we're willing to support or at least grudgingly accept. And then, and only then, moving to the application of that kind of a process to specific projects, plans, or programs that city government is proposing or considering at the local level. And applying that kind of process alongside and parallel to the legally required public process. What I found is that properly designed and with the proper commitment of time, energy, and resources, that this kind of process is extremely effective. People become much more knowledgeable about the issues and the problems, and they are fully capable of dealing with the complexity of public policy issues and the nuances around that. When you have the inclusive dialogue, people become much more empathetic and much more understanding of the circumstances and the lives of other folks in their community whose lives are different than them. And then most importantly, they become much more supportive of at least trying to address the problem, and even so far as willing to make trade-offs and sacrifices and reconcile, try very hard to reconcile their own narrow self-interest with the good of the community. So how does this relate to the subject of this conversation, the subject of this panel? I'd say at least in two ways. Number one is that regardless of where you stand on the question of where decision-making authority should lie, state, regional, or local, you can't get to solutions, I believe, unless you go through the public in one way or another. If you're a fan of local control, for example, your best chance to get the state off your back is to build sustained political support and find that common ground in your community so that you can move forward on local housing solutions where you do have autonomy. If you think that there's room for the state to impose solutions at the local level, I think it's still advantageous to engage people seriously around that decision and around that rationale, because the risk I see with some of the state imposition is a backlash. Say for example, if we mandate minimum density around transit stations, what is that going to do for the decisions where local officials do have autonomy when the public is clearly upset about what's going on through that state imposition? So I think no matter what your approach is, and no matter how we land on the appropriate balance on various policy solutions, I think we have to always keep at the forefront of our mind the role of the public and serious commitment to engagement. The other way I think it relates to the questions that we're talking about here is that when you engage, in my experience, when you engage people around precisely this question of who should make these decisions and what's the appropriate balance of state, regional, and local authority, I hear very consistently, you get a very clear message from folks in my experience. They're extremely wary of state overreach and don't want the state to come into their communities at all. They want to retain local land use authority around at the point of decision making. And yet at the same time, they clearly believe that this is a regional problem. that no single, that the solution cannot come solely at the local level. And so there's a strong appetite for greater regional coordination. And I would suggest, and then I'll stop, I'd love to talk about this further, that there's a kind of sweet spot here, at least from the public acceptance standpoint, of a greater regional role around housing policy and housing solutions. And I think that sweet spot focuses on three things. One is technical assistance from either the region or the county to local government, a convening function among local governments, and potentially funding support. And I'm happy to talk about some examples from the Bay Area and San Mateo County, and in particular where I work mostly, but I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Greg. And so I think what Greg has told us is that governance doesn't begin at local government, it begins at the people. And that done right, then we have a chance of tiering our legal authorities from the local to the regional to the state in ways that could get us where we want to be. And so maybe we can explore that and explore the sweet spot a little bit. We don't have a strong advocate for state domination here, so and I'm not going to play that role. But in absence of that, I'd be interested. The governor put on the plate in January a proposal that included funding for technical assistance, that included financial incentives, but then also included the consequence that Lydia pointed out. So from this perspective that you've articulated, that local control is the right place to be making these decisions and dealing with the public and reconciling the potential conflicts, is that the right approach for the state to take in terms of incentives and consequences, or incentives only, or how would you structure those? And are there better incentives and or sticks, if that's what you want to call it, than what the governor has put on the table? What would you rather, if you don't like what the governor did, what would you have rather seen him do? Okay, right.
I'll go. Well, I think that the local jurisdictions did fight really hard to support the increase in the gas tax, and I think that there's a general sense from a majority of them that now tying housing requirements to receipt of that money is probably not an appropriate way to go. But the devil's still in details. I mean, we really haven't seen anything come out that is provides details with regard to what that really means. Are we talking about a continued planning for housing and affordable housing, such as existing RENA processes, or are we talking about something that's a little bit more harsh, and forcing jurisdictions to somehow build housing, which, as we said earlier, is something that they really have no control over. So, that's a concern. While I personally think that the incentives that are envisioned in the governor's proposal are helpful, I still think that, at least for our subregion, that what's really missing from this is the recognition that we are in a state where people's income is generally declining and the price of housing is increasing. And so what we really need to be doing is maybe putting more energy into economic development and actually providing good middle-class jobs that would provide, and that in itself becomes a spur for housing. And I think that that's something that's sorely missing in the plan. And so in my view, just for example, $500 million that would go as incentives for housing could probably be much better utilized by being provided to regional entities or local governments as economic development incentives. So I think that maybe I'm trying to sort of make a spin on this and say that maybe there's maybe the approach of saying we need to do whatever we can to build housing any place, anywhere, at any level. It's well grounded and it might be well founded, but the practicalities on how to get there differ, and they differ very significantly depending on what kind of a region you're in, what the status of its employment base and income levels are.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Rick. Richard?
Just a couple of comments along those lines. First, that was a wonderful discussion of public input in how to conduct that, and I just cannot imagine a land use plan from the state having that level of personal touch that's necessary to gain consensus. So I'll come back to the fact that the state is leaping into the land use area. They really need to deal with the things that they have control of and that they created, which is CEQA and the RENA process. The RENA process to many communities, amazing that Lydia's community met its RENA allocation, but you're probably one of a few that have. But to most communities, it's sort of a black box. They're handed a number, they don't know why, and they don't know how they're going to meet that number. So reform in that and getting a buy-in on what that number is from the big picture is I think is very important. I've said a little bit about CEQA, but on the regional level, one of the things that comes to mind is what the Southern California Association of Governments did a number of years ago when they looked at the RHNA number and transit. And they took a lot of the fear out of planning and gaining housing. And I think they called it, if my memory is correct, the 2% solution, meaning that of all the region, you really only had to impact 2% of the land use to make the RHNA goal for the entire region. You didn't need to touch the single-family homes. There were some industrial areas you could say are out of bounds, but they really provided, I thought, some very valuable leadership to cities and city staff on how to achieve your RHNA goals. So I think the idea of the big framework idea on a regional level, both in transit and in housing, was invaluable from the regional planning level.
And Richard, just to be clear, do you think that it's an appropriate role for the state to have a RHNA process and that it needs to be improved, or do you think that too is them leaving their lane?
I think there is. I think someone has to look at the big picture, and I think the idea of having a RHNA and, quite frankly, forcing cities through that process, which, because of the way the tax structure in Prop 13, you can love it or hate it. It is really, if you look at it from a city manager's perspective, mostly a disincentive to build housing and an incentive to build industrial uses or retail uses. Because the research that I've done over the last number of years, every house is a loser in terms of city services that to be provided in pure sort of bottom line cost benefit. It costs more than it benefits the city. So if you look at it purely at numbers, it's a loser. So someone has to take leadership on the big level, but in terms of implementation, I think there's a role for the region, and then obviously a role for the cities. One other comment, there was made the comment of the loss of redevelopment, and what I think we also lost in the loss of redevelopment, not only the dollars and cents, but there was a whole staffing issue with redevelopment, where redevelopment, economic development professionals were funded through redevelopment and looked at the most troubling parts of the city in a very deliberate way, and we lost that staff expertise. And we really, I think cities need to either gain that back themselves or look to regional authorities to gain that back, because it was a true loss at City Hall of the expertise.
Great. Lydia, did you have any thoughts on that?
Just very, throughout my career, we've had these broad discussions. I've been in local government for almost 30 years. And we've always had the carrot and stick approach, especially for housing issues. And it always surrounded during the RHNA allocation time. I think improving the RHNA process so we know what that magical black box is and what it looks like when the state hands the region a number and says, now you need to divide this up among cities, and then the cities fight under the cog to figure out who gets what. I worked in a community in which my moderate housing community took the lion's share of the affordable housing RHNA numbers for the entire region, where the higher end communities took 2 or 3. So there's got to be a fair process with that RHNA process. San Diego County is coming up with their new RHNA process that should be starting this year. And my council and my community is very fearful that they're going to push all of the affordable housing down to my community, because it's a community of color and it's a lower economic community. Well, there's no way I can build that. There's no way any developer will come and build that, because our housing, our property issues are insurmountable for a developer to accumulate enough property to build the amount of housing that we will need. So I think taking a look at that, and I think what is that carrot and what is that stick is really what needs to be decided. And right now, I don't think governor's proposal is right there, and I think just for the reasons that Rick said, is all cities banded together, both the Republican side of the House and the Democratic side of the House of council members, and really supported SB1 because they knew streets and roads are an economic driver. Streets and roads help with housing. And then one last thing before we lose that is, when we talk about housing, we forget one key ingredient is community. And cities and counties are made up of more than just housing. You have schools, you have parks, you have, how is the infrastructure going to handle the increased housing with a sewer system? How does that all work together when you focus on one aspect of an entire community? You need to look and engage the community as a community as whole and grow it together, opposed to grow it in parts.
Thank you very much. This list has 180 bills on it that have been introduced in the last mostly 90 days. But we've only really heard much referenced today. The only one we've really heard much about is SB 50. And so I want to probe one part of this. A few minutes ago, Alicia told us that what we really needed was some clear definitions at a community level around that by right zone. Where you can have control about where that is, but then how do you move that so it's not discretionary in terms of projects that comply with that? And I know there's lots of subtlety to that issue. But what I'm trying to tease out for you in terms of this state-local relationship is you see a tendency on the state to want to define where that would be because they don't see local governments stepping up and doing that. And is that a signal to local governments, which many have done, but not all of them, to take this local control to that level where you build the kind of community buy-in that Greg's talked about, but then you create a process that takes out the time and the risk and the uncertainty, which Alicia said was the largest cost driver that she thought we could control. I'm summarizing what she said. But if the state's not going to move in this position, into this direction, is there a preemptive way for local governments to seize this part of our challenge?
So I'll start on that one. Just a little story. So in Lemon Grove, since my tenure there, we've gone and did an engagement process to do a specific plan to create more transit-oriented development around our transit line. We have a trolley line that goes through our city, and we have vacant properties, and we've been talking with the rail provider of increasing housing. So we did a 2.5-year process. We did the small community groups. We created a plan in which we had community buy-in. We got to the city council. We did multiple workshops. And when it passed first reading on the zoning ordinance and the plan was ready to go, it got pulled and it died on second reading, and councils reversed themselves. Once I looked back and figured out what was going on, is what this plan represented was dramatic change for a community that wasn't ready to change. Even though they had all of the carrots that they asked for, and even though we did all of the public engagement, once they saw the totality of the plan, which had by right zoning for TOD, they all became very afraid of change. And the two issues is my older community was afraid of too many people, and my younger community was afraid of gentrification. And we don't know how to do that with by right zoning, because by right zoning, I think, looking back, will lead to gentrification, because if you look at the bill that's proposed, which is SB 50, that entices private sector development to create market rate with affordable housing sprinkled in. But if it truly is about workforce housing and affordable housing, then let by right be for nonprofit housing developers, which will then create more workforce and affordable housing in the very low, and maybe moderate range. Market rate housing, I don't think it's got a problem. I think it's the very low, and the moderate range housing that has issues.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. Agree with that. I think that when you start talking about by right zoning, you're really trading into that very well-guarded world of local control. And I think that once you start moving in that direction, you're always going to have elected officials saying, okay, well, what's after this, and what's after this, and what's after this, and all of a sudden, the very thing that local elected officials are elected to do, which is to serve their communities, that ability disappears. So I'm really wary of that. At the same time, there was also some discussion on an earlier panel about how local jurisdictions need to kind of look at their processes and get out of the way, and I think that we all tend to agree with that to a certain extent, but only to a certain extent. And what I found is whenever we have these discussions about streamlining permit processes within our jurisdictions, invariably all the jurisdictions, if you talk to them individually, will tell you that they think their process is about as streamlined as they can get. So everybody has a differing opinion about what streamline means. So at the local level, they might think their process is fantastic, and then if you talk to a developer in that community, they say this is like the worst nightmare ever. So I don't know how you're going to ever really get through that. But what also struck me is something that Rick Cole mentioned in his lunch discussion with Dean Peterson, and that is that, you know, local jurisdictions do have the responsibility to build communities. I mean, we have a tremendous surge of population coming our way. You know, just in the Skag region, another 4 million people are coming here, and we need to find ways to provide affordable housing to them. But if we skirt standards and if we make processes easier, we're going to end up with potentially products that don't look great. And if you have products that don't look great and they're not in the right areas and they don't benefit from public acceptance, you're just exacerbating the problem. You're going to make it even more difficult to continue to build housing. And so I think it's really important for local jurisdictions to take very seriously the responsibility they have to provide housing, but I don't see it being beneficial for them to be skirting processes that result in design standards that create quality products that the public can embrace and be proud of.
Thank you, Richard.
Let me disagree with the people to my left and right and may get squeezed in this. One is we are never going to pay our way out of the affordable housing crisis. So the idea that we have enough subsidy to subsidize our way out of this is difficult to imagine. When you look at an affordable housing project, and I've talked to many involved, the price per unit is somewhere around, at the low end, $300,000 to $500,000 per unit, which is, to me, somewhat unimaginable, but I keep getting that number from all the experts. So to think that we have the needs we have times 500,000 is, so we've got to build more on top of all the subsidies we can do. Someone who lands in a subsidized unit has absolutely hit the lottery. The numbers are astounding when you talk to any nonprofit or housing authority at how long the line is to get that unit. So, secondly, with regard to Rick's comment, I think we can devise rules, design guidelines in zoning that keeps the quality, both keeps the quality and directs the housing to the right spaces if you do the zoning right and have the right community engagement. That if you check all the boxes and you do the right design, meet the guidelines, you should be incentivized to go through with no discretionary action, meaning you throw CEQA to the side. And in the one example is in Pasadena, there was an uproar prior to my time there. It was, I believe it was in the 90s, where they designed, where apartment buildings were being built, apartment and condos, and they were looking horrendous. They were the old dingbat type projects that we've all seen. And they devised a local zoning code called City of Gardens, which required underground parking, garden facing the street, units facing the street. And if you met that standard, and it was a very strict standard, you got a pass. You got your permit. Tough standard. Smart developers figured it out, and a lot of housing got produced, and it was high quality housing. So I think there is a way. It takes a lot of skill on both the public and private side to devise guidelines and standards that need to be met, but it can be a by right application or by right development.
One of Greg's observations from his experience was that if you do that civic engagement right, people recognize that there has to be a regional approach to the problem, and even willing in their own minds to reconcile some of their cognitive dissonance and their conflict. But going to that first part, is there this idea of regional governance in California has never gone very far without the proponent being taken away, drawn and quartered, and I'm not suggesting that at all, but is there an opportunity, and maybe you, Rick, you can start this, but your colleagues can help you, to maybe amp up the role of our regional coalitions of governments, or councils of government, in order to get to some of these things that that Richard in particular has been talking about, processes that are really working, civic engagement that really works, best practices about when something moves to a by right status in order to circumvent unnecessary time, risk, and is there a model here for governments to be working more collaboratively to actually address some of these sticky, sclerotic issues?
Yeah, I think so, and obviously as a regional person, I find that there's a lot of opportunity for regions to contribute to an issue like this that, quite frankly, is regional. I mean, when we talk about housing issues, you know, you never should confine the housing issues in your city. So if your city is doing it right, it doesn't really matter if the cities around you aren't doing it right. And so that's why you have the term housing sheds. That's why we have the term water sheds. That's why we have the term transit or transportation sheds, air sheds, things of that nature. So, you know, we are all in this together, and that's why we prepare regional plans. And so, Jim, I think there is a very necessary place for regions to play a role in being able to, you know, do the things that Greg had talked about. I think you talked about being able to provide technical assistance, convening local jurisdictions so they can talk about problems, common problems, and see if they can find cost-effective ways to deal with them. I think one of the things that councils of governments and regional agencies can do best is they can create template documents that can then be tailored, you know, for particular circumstances and jurisdictions at great cost savings, and it provides elected officials from different jurisdictions who are all in different stages of their urban evolution to compare notes and talk about best practices that have worked and things that haven't. So I think that's really one of the values that councils of governments had. And then also, I think Greg mentioned, you know, providing funding support. And that's one thing we've been able to do actually at WRCOG is help our local jurisdictions seek grants. We have a grant assistance program where we've provided about $700,000 in funds to help our local jurisdictions find funding to address issues such as this. So
Thank you.
That's important.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Lee.
No, I was going to just jump in and say that the regional approach does work. I have to say that being from San Diego County and working in San Diego County, Sandag works. Sandag is our regional government, our COG, and they both control transportation dollars and land use dollars, or land use issues, and they convene all 19 cities in the county together to work. There is a technical working group for the planning directors and planning departments. They share best processes. When I was in San Marcos, we did a whole Kaizen process to better look at what our planning processes didn't get there, but we were looking at that. And that's how we were able to work collaboratively together. There was, if most of you follow legislation, a couple of years ago, Assemblymember Lorena Gonzalez introduced a bill to change the structure of Sandag. And there was real fear that cooperation will go away. It hasn't been evident. We're going on to the second year of this new machination where the city of San Diego and the city of Chula Vista, the two largest cities in the county, really control the table. They've actually stepped back and continue to work on that cooperation. There's a new executive director who talks about continued regional governance and regional cooperation amongst the large cities and the small cities. So we have Sandag is working towards that. I don't think we're perfect, but they are working towards some of those solutions so we can engage each other in what works, what doesn't work, who's doing what, and then awarding those agencies with transportation dollars. I know my agency got awarded with quite a few of the locally generated transportation dollars for the housing that we were able to produce.
Yeah, I'll give a few examples from San Mateo County at the countywide level that I think are easily scalable to the region, and then a couple of things that are being proposed at the regional level. On the technical assistance side, with respect to RENA, San Mateo County was the first county in the state to take advantage of a provision in the RENA law that said that counties, the local jurisdictions within the county can decide among themselves how to allocate the countywide number. So in other words, instead of what's typical elsewhere of having every city have its own number handed down, Association of Area Governments handed a number to the county of San Mateo, and all the cities came together and went through a somewhat painful, but in the end, ultimately productive process of deciding how to split that number up among themselves. That flexibility allowed cities where, really wealthy small communities where you're never going to get any affordable housing, for example, just never realistic, to essentially pay other communities to build that housing for them. Whether that's a good idea or not, that it worked, and so what came out of that process as well was this initiative called 21 Elements, or 21 jurisdictions, 20 cities in the county and San Mateo County. And as far as technical assistance, it's a forum in which there's a database of all the housing elements for all the cities, and they meet periodically and compare best practices, and you can see what other cities are doing. You can learn lessons about what worked and didn't work, and it's really improved, I believe, the robustness of the process of developing housing elements, and it's very collaborative. Another example of technical assistance, I talked about community engagement, is the county's Home for All initiative. It grew out of a stakeholder process. This is something I consulted on. They have a community engagement pilot program where the county actually has made grants to individual cities to provide them with funding to engage their residents, technical support, and consulting support of facilitators and community engagement designers and things like that. And that's worked really well. And I see no reason why you're doing that at the county level that couldn't also happen at the regional level. On the convening side, the Home for All initiative also has developed what they call a learning network, and it's a forum in which all of the cities in the county come together again, probably every 2 to 3 months, and share lessons learned and focus on a particular topic. One of the things that they learned early on when they established Home for All was that even though you have 20 cities in the county between San Francisco and San Jose, all lined up one after another, they don't talk to each other, and they had very little understanding of what other cities were doing on housing. On the funding side, there's something in the Bay Area called the CASA Compact, which has just been released recently. It came out of an 18-month stakeholder process, and it's essentially a 10-point policy platform for proposals at the regional level, all to address production, preservation of existing housing, and to address displacement protection for renters. And some of those policy proposals need to be enacted at the state level, so right now they're going through a process of taking it to Sacramento. But one thing that's really intriguing, there's a lot of controversial stuff in there, and for the most part, people have a kind of negative reaction to the whole thing. It's a good focus, but we weren't involved, not transparent, no local representation, we don't like this, that, or the other. But something that's really intriguing to me is the idea of actually forming a Bay Area-wide housing authority, which would have the power to tax and also then to allocate funding in an equitable and more efficient, is the concept, more efficient way throughout the region, say for things that the cities can't afford and that would otherwise come out of their general funds, like renter support, relocation assistance, things like that, and potentially to buy down, deepen the affordability of homes. And yeah, I think that's really intriguing. The idea is to raise $1.5 billion a year, and it's a long process before that would ever happen, but the whole notion of a regional housing authority is certainly new and intriguing.
So we've got a few great questions here, and so one of them raises the question of counties beyond just their local land use authority and areas where they are the local land use authority because it's unincorporated. Do any of you see a role for counties to be playing part of this glue, part of this capacity building, perhaps the link between housing and economic development? Should we be, as we think about our governance, is there something we should be exploring around the role of counties in this regard beyond that permitting process?
No, the County of LA for years has made grants to developers both in incorporated areas and unincorporated areas. So they've done that, and they are starting a process, and I think to provide technical assistance. On the homeless issue, they've really taken a leadership role in partnership with the city of LA. So in that area, they put a lot of money into it. They led the charge for the sales tax surcharge, and I think they've provided a great leadership in that one area. So I think there is capacity building and funding were two areas that they focused on.
Yeah, and in the housing, they bring their social service work and their mental health work and other things to that table, and it forms a partnership around the needs there.
Absolutely, because one of the, I think the revelation, I think, at the county recently was that doing the housing and all the services, they just need to be married together. The issues are so great that you can't do them independently.
So, Laura, I had written down in my notes, do we really have to fight Malibu and Beverly Hills, when you said we should fight Malibu and Beverly Hills, but she didn't want me to forget that, so she wrote it on a card. And the way she framed this is we've got lots of places where they've done public engagement, but local control in all places hasn't resulted in housing. And so I know this may be a challenge for you who are parts of the League of California Cities and others, but do you give way that there are some cities out there that actually don't want to go through with this? And if that's the case, what's the state's role or responsibility to make sure that the folks that truly, I'm not calling out these names, but you all probably know the cities that are not doing what you're doing, and what should the state's response to that be?
And that's a difficult question. I'll talk from the city's perspective. That's a difficult nut to crack, because if you really are about local autonomy and community governance and citizen engagement, then that's the community's voice. That's what the community has said. Again, when I worked up in Marin County, there were two higher-end communities, the city of Belvedere and the city of Tiburon, who wanted nothing to do with affordable housing at all. They were able to, at the time I was there, a long time ago, manipulate the laws in which their housing staff for the large estate houses were part of affordable housing, and then met their mandate of 3 or 4. But that's a hard one, and I think if you look more at the regional approach, you can get communities to understand that they need to share in the housing. It's not one community's responsibility. And I think talking, my 2 colleagues here talked about maybe we come together and talk about why it's important that we share the housing, so we can get the Malibus or the Belvederes to understand that housing need is for all communities. It's not just one.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think one of the public engagement is super important, and it's also really poorly executed by most local jurisdictions. I think this is probably an over-exaggeration, but I think a lot of people think that 3-minute public comment period is like public engagement. It's probably not the case, but I think it's kind of a two-way street. I mean, I think it's important for community leaders to want to hear from the community on how they want their community shaped with development process, both residential and non-residential. So that goes back to I want to disagree with you disagreeing with me earlier. I do think that there are certain processes that can be put in place that can, hit a lot of those design standards. But I still think at the end, when you're talking about developing communities, it's important for elected officials to let their constituents touch the project, and the only way to do that is through public engagement, which can certainly be improved. But part of public engagement, especially when you're talking about housing, also it's important for, I think, local elected officials to be able to publicly educate their constituents at the same time. I think that's a critical piece that's missing. And when we talk about housing and housing future Californians, we know that SCAG data is telling us right now that our future growth is largely going to be the product of natural increase. So in other words, in Southern California, the battle between sex and dying, sex is winning. And so what we're seeing is growth is occurring from our own people and from within. And so it really is important for our community leaders to educate members within their communities that, when we're talking about an issue that they might be disagreeing with because it's a NIMBY issue or whatever, that we're looking to house people within our community who in many cases are already here. I think one of my staff told me recently that they read a stat that in the city of Oakland, 10% of the public service workers can afford to live in Oakland. That's a real problem. And if that's something that could be educated, from our community leaders to the community, that might certainly help in kind of pushing back a little bit on sort of the knee-jerk reaction to just not build anything anywhere at any time.
So we've got one question here that kind of challenges the role of elimination of redevelopment is playing in our housing crisis, given the limited role that redevelopment had in essential but limited role in providing housing. And there's another related question that's about if we were to move back towards a redevelopment 2.0, which there's some conversation in Sacramento, I'm not sure it's getting a lot of momentum. Are there things we would do to remedy the abuses that were the poster childs that were used to get rid of it? But maybe link it here into another part of our earlier conversation where Richard pointed out that there's a whole, under Prop 13, there's a whole, and other fiscal evolutions, there's a whole lot of desirable projects that don't pencil out, and it is connected to the fee structures and others. And so is it safe to start to formulate some ideas that Sacramento should be considering how it could put money into community and housing development in ways that would allow those base costs to be met, right? To allow you to cover the local infrastructure that might have been covered by redevelopment, and potentially then also provide the incentives for the kinds of housing that would do the most to meet the workforce needs. So reflecting on the 2.0 isn't just Jerry's gone, let's bring it back, but the 2.0 is something much more akin to what's the next step forward in terms of state support for the community infrastructure necessary to meet both community and state goals.
Okay, so the answer is yes. I think we should explore that. There were certainly a lot of abuses in redevelopment that were the poster childs, but there was also a lot done that was very, very positive by communities of goodwill that wanted to do good. By way of disclaimer, I was the chair of the California Redevelopment Association 2 chairs before Jerry Brown took that action. So I'm a big believer in redevelopment. There were abuses. I think there are ways to close those gaps and focus much more on housing. And I think there are many of the tools that redevelopment brought to the table, as you enumerated a few of them, the ability to build infrastructure, maybe even assembling sites for housing that would certainly have an impact on housing production.
Excellent.
And also, the other point I'd make is that the redevelopment did bring a certain level of expertise in staffing and real estate transactional experience, which many cities and counties sorely lack and get taken, quite frankly, in that transactional business with the public and private sector. So I think it's definitely worth looking at, and I think there are some very big positives could come out of that.
Excellent, thank you.
So having worked for the 13th largest redevelopment agency in the state, which was San Marcos, we generated 20% of all of our set-aside went to affordable housing. So if you look at the numbers, I think during dissolution, about $6 billion were generated per year for affordable housing on redevelopment agencies across the state. And that directly subsidized either for-profit affordable housing developers or non-profit affordable housing developers, because taking a step back and looking at the state reforming itself, they layered on, it has to meet X standard for housing if you're giving them redevelopment dollars. It has to be labor and union wages, regardless of whether they use prevailing rate, which increases it. They layered on a lot of mandates on affordable housing, which increased the cost per unit. The same house that was built for a market rate doesn't have those mandates that they have to do. So take a look at that as well. So I think redevelopment did contribute to that. Redevelopment also did housing subsidies. We, in the agency that I worked for, we required ownership housing, and the redevelopment agency was a silent second for most of those folks. They couldn't afford it. They didn't qualify, so we had to be the silent second to keep affordable housing for ownership housing. Because let's talk about the two different types of housing stocks. When most developers talk about affordable housing, they're talking about rental. They're not talking about ownership, and you need to create some ownership housing. And two, absolutely, housing, if you look at the fiscalization of land, and that has been the talk since Prop 13, housing doesn't pay its way. Every community, but I think in San Diego County, exception for one, which is Coronado, people pay more in their cell phone and cable bills than they do in their property tax to pay for local services. My community, for example, I get between 7 and 12 cents of every property tax dollar. The property tax I receive in our general fund is $4.3 million. My sheriff's contract is 5.5. So it doesn't even pay for the delivery of law enforcement services. And I'm a prime example of what it looks like throughout California. 13 really did hurt the property tax value, which is why, if you remember back in the 90s, for most of you that have been around, 90s and early 2000s, people were aghast about, oh my gosh, why are we bringing all the Costco's or Walmarts? Because they generated a lot of property. They generated a lot of sales tax, and sales tax was king because that's what supported the services that everybody wanted, from recreation subsidy to better roads and sewers. So there has to be a balance with that fiscalization of land. So yes, I think reforming and looking at Prop 13, and I know that there is a bill, Senator, his name is escaping me, has a bill that looks at the reform of Prop 13 to reassess commercial rates, but it really has hurt local governments and service delivery, which is why there's a pushback on building additional housing.
So one final question here. We called out a couple of times in our conversation today the role of CEQA in adding time and cost and uncertainty. And Richard, you pointed out to us that if the state wanted to do something, it would do something about CEQA. So if I'm getting back on a plane in an hour and flying back north, and someone's going to say, "What did they want us to do?" I'm curious. If this is an issue, as Jennifer has documented many times, why aren't local governments uniting around the things that they want the state to change as part of this conversation that is not going to go away until we make progress about the things that it could do something about? And I think many of us understand the dynamics about why it hasn't changed, but silence isn't going to change it either. So what's the role in local governments in helping to resolve that issue in Sacramento?
I think it's going to be very difficult for local government to, quite frankly, to step up, because it's been the marriage of labor and the environmentalists who have sort of preserved that space. So it's going to be difficult to come, quite frankly, from the bottom up. I think is my take on it. From the top down, this is a leadership question, and even rewriting some of the CEQA guidelines, I spoke to the folks who write those, and we just wanted some guidance on climate change and what should be in that. They refuse to even attack it. At this point, they won't even give you guidance. So simply doing their job and giving you guidance would be helpful, but also dealing with time frames in the law. Or what is astounding to me is that if you've seen a large project come through, some of these are 7 or 8 volumes and would fill this entire table. The idea of CEQA was to give people some alternatives, some ideas of what would be less environmentally destructive, and to clearly evaluate what the project is. I defy anyone to take a look at that document, one, to read it from end to end, and two, to answer those 2 questions. What in this document tells you what's better, and what in the document tells you what the impact of this is? So if they could simply get back to, I don't think anyone has a problem with what the original intent was, but just make it simpler. And it's become an enormous industry of lawyers and technicians, but doesn't inform the public. So I think it's got to be top down and some leadership in Sacramento. It's their space. Stay out of our space of land use. Solve your own problems. Would be my message.
Anyone have any other thoughts on that?
I have talked to my colleagues. I used to be a staff member for the League of California Cities back in early in my career, but I know that was always been on our to-do list, and I do know, talking to the assistant executive director, the executive director, and the lobbyist in charge of housing, that's always on their top list when they talk to any new legislature about, let's do some CEQA reform, and they have some real bullet points of what they would like to see at CEQA reform. One is a disincentive for lawsuits, and not allow those attorneys that bring it on to get rewarded with huge settlements. And we've got one in San Diego County that's made a lot of money bringing on nonsense CEQA lawsuits. However, just as my colleague has said, it's very hard, because when you get up to Sacramento, you lose your mind, and you really are married with labor and environmentalists, and those are the 2 groups you don't want to cross when you're a Democrat. And right now, they're the supermajority, and they're the ones that we have to take a look at and try and appeal to. Even those that come from the local level, there's something in that water, they really do lose their mind. I don't know what the answer is, aside from coming from the bottom up, and maybe that is something where it has to come up. I can tell you, it doesn't matter what side out, but it's something that we know we don't get any traction with the 120 members of the state legislature, year after year after year.
So I suggest that's a conversation over an adult cocktail, because expecting Sacramento to respond without some local support for that is not rational. And if that's the change that you think the state can make the most progress on to help you make the most of your local authority to accomplish your goals, then I think that needs to be communicated strongly and consistently with the right constellation of civil rights activists and others, until you can create a counterbalance to what's happening there. And we've shown our willingness at California Forward to help be part of that conversation. Pete, we haven't solved the entire problem, but I think what we have done is we've certainly explored what's possible for the highest quality possible local control and local decision making, perhaps an even stronger and emerging future for regional coalition and cooperation and technical assistance in working through that, and a strong desire for everybody down here for me to go back to Sacramento and tell people to stay in their lane, which is apparently the lane that has not yet been built on I-5 to come to Southern California. So thank you very much, everybody on the panel.